If you've been paying attention to world events lately, you've probably noticed something unusual, almost unsettling. A tiny strip of land, no bigger than New Jersey, keeps showing up in headlines, in political debates, and even in theological conversations. I'm talking about Israel. It's as if history, prophecy, and modern politics have all converged on this one point, like the lens of a magnifying glass focusing sunlight until it burns. And the more time passes, the brighter and hotter that spotlight becomes. But here's the bigger question: is this just a coincidence? Or is it by design? The Bible seems to suggest the latter, that God Himself has placed Israel at the center of the world stage for the grand finale of human history. And if that's true, then what's happening right now is more than just politics. It's prophecy unfolding before our eyes. So, today, we're going to unpack the story. Not just the headlines, but the deep roots of this ongoing conflict, stretching all the way back to the Old Testament. We'll uncover how a promise made thousands of years ago still shapes the news today, and why it may be pointing us towards something much bigger, something final. But first, let me set the scene with a reminder. The conflict we see today between Israelis and Palestinians didn't just erupt out of nowhere. It's not a simple he said, she said argument over real estate. It's a layered, messy, and often misunderstood story, one that requires us to go back. Way back, the promise that started it all. Before we dive into the politics, we need to understand the promise. According to the Bible, God made a covenant with the people of Israel, His chosen people. And this covenant wasn't just spiritual, it was geographical. God promised them a homeland. Now here's the twist. The Bible also records that even when God disciplined them, even when they were scattered, He promised to bring them back to that same land in the last days, right before the return of Jesus. That's a bold claim. And for centuries, it seemed impossible. After all, in 70 AD, the Romans expelled the Jews from their homeland, scattering them across the known world. Empires rose and fell over that land: Rome, Byzantium, Islamic caliphates, Crusader states, the Ottoman Empire, the British Mandate, yet somehow the land never became the permanent nation of another people. It's almost as if it was being preserved for something. 1948, a nation is born again. Fast forward nearly 2,000 years. The year is 1948, against all odds. After the horrors of the Holocaust and centuries of exile, the Jewish people declare the birth of the modern state of Israel. In one day, the ancient promise and the modern world collide. That moment was more than a political event. For many, it was proof that biblical prophecy was alive. Of course, the declaration didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after decades of migration back to the land, a process that began in the mid-1800s, when small groups of Jews returned to what was then called Palestine. The land was barren, neglected, and sparsely populated. But they worked it, cultivated it, and made it bloom again. Here's where it gets interesting. As the land prospered, people from surrounding Arab nations began moving in as well, drawn by the opportunities. By the early 20th century, Jews and Arabs were both living in the land, setting the stage for the identity struggles we see today. A real-life example: my grandfather's field. Let me pause here for a personal story. My grandfather, not in Israel, but in another part of the Middle East, owned a small, dry piece of land. Nobody wanted it. But he believed it could produce something, so he worked the soil, planted crops, and turned it into a thriving orchard. Guess what happened next? Suddenly, neighbors who had ignored the land for years started saying, well, actually, that land has always been ours. It's human nature. We rarely fight for something when it's worthless, but once it shows value, the battle begins. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened in Palestine, from promise to problem. When Israel declared independence in 1948, it didn't just mark the rebirth of a nation, it sparked an ongoing conflict. Arab neighbors, including Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq, opposed the creation of Israel and went to war. The Palestinians, many of whom had arrived in the previous decades, claimed the land was theirs. The Israelis countered with thousands of years of historical and spiritual connection to the same land. And the two sides have been locked in a cycle of war, displacement, and uneasy truces ever since. But here's what often gets overlooked. From a prophetic perspective, this tension isn't a bug in the system. It's part of the design. The Bible foretold that in the last days, Israel would be a cup of trembling for all nations, a place of constant dispute and global attention. That's exactly what we're seeing today. In part 2, we'll go deeper into the historical turning points, the empires that controlled the land, why Palestine was never officially a state before Israel, and how each occupation pushed the region closer to the flashpoint we see now. We'll also explore why this small nation seems destined to be the center of the world's final battle, Armageddon. One of the most misunderstood parts of this whole story is the idea that Israel took the land from someone else in 1948. The truth is, for centuries, nobody really wanted this land. Travelers from the 1800s, like Mark Twain, described Palestine as barren, swampy in the north, dusty and lifeless in the south. Twain literally called it a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. It wasn't some bustling, thriving paradise that got snatched away overnight. It was underpopulated, underdeveloped, and, quite frankly, ignored. A land passed like a hot potato. This land has changed hands so many times it's dizzying. Romans drove out the Jews in 70 AD and renamed the region Palestine to erase Jewish identity. Byzantines took over, followed by Islamic caliphates in the 7th century. The Crusaders came in the 11th century, then were pushed out by Muslim armies. The Ottomans ruled from the 1500s to World War I after WI. Britain took control under the British Mandate. Not once in all those centuries did the land become the recognized independent nation of Palestine. It was always a territory under someone else's rule, the British Mandate, and a brewing storm. By the early 1900s, the Jewish migration back to the land was accelerating. This was called Aliyah, the return, and it was fueled by both religious longing and the growing persecution of Jews in Europe. Britain tried to balance promises made to both Jews and Arabs, but their policies often made things worse. The infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917 promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, but the British also made separate promises to Arab leaders. It was a recipe for tension, and it boiled over in the 1930s and 40s. Anti-Jewish riots broke out, and restrictions on Jewish immigration were tightened, even as Jews in Europe were desperately trying to escape the Holocaust. 1948, war before the ink was dry. When Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, it was immediately attacked by 5 Arab armies. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was an all-out attempt to wipe the newborn nation off the map. Against all odds, Israel not only survived, but expanded its territory beyond the UN's original partition plan. For many Christians, this victory wasn't just military, it was miraculous. Here's a real-life story from that war. In one battle, Israeli defenders were down to almost no ammunition. They resorted to faking larger numbers by driving trucks in circles to kick up dust, making it look like reinforcements had arrived. The enemy, convinced they were outnumbered, retreated. Strategy? Yes, providence? Many believe so. 1967, the 6-day lightning strike. Fast forward to June 1967. Surrounded by Arab armies once again, Israel launched a preemptive strike. In just 6 days, they captured the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai Peninsula, and most importantly, East Jerusalem, including the Old City, Jerusalem, the heartbeat of the biblical narrative. The city where Jesus taught, where Solomon's temple once stood, and where prophecy says history will reach its climax. The significance wasn't lost on anyone who knew the Bible. Zechariah's prophecy that Jerusalem would be a burdensome stone for all nations seemed more relevant than ever. A real-life parallel, the old family home. This reminds me of a friend of mine whose family home was taken during a war. Decades later, his children managed to buy it back. Standing in that old house again, even though the walls were cracked and the paint was peeling, brought tears to their eyes. It wasn't about real estate. It was about identity, memory, and belonging. That's how many Jews feel about Jerusalem. It's not just prime property, it's their story. The prophetic thread, if you zoom out, you start to see a pattern. The scattering of the Jewish people, prophesied. Their return to the land, prophesied. The constant global attention, prophesied, and the growing hostility from surrounding nations, also prophesied. The Bible paints a picture of Israel as the epicenter of the final conflict, the place where God will ultimately step in, not just to defend a nation, but to establish his kingdom. And if you think this is just ancient poetry, look at the headlines. World leaders fly to Jerusalem more than to almost any other city. Every move Israel makes is analyzed, criticized, debated. No other country of its size wields this much influence on the world stage. In Part 3, we'll tie it all together, how current events might be aligning with biblical prophecy, why Jerusalem could be the flashpoint for the next world crisis, and the powerful lesson we can take away from all of this, whether we're religious or not. If you've made it this far, thanks, because this is where history, faith, and real-world consequences collide. In Part 1 and Part 2, we trace the long arc, ancient promises, centuries of exile, slow returns, the modern rebirth of Israel, and the way Jerusalem keeps pulling the world's attention. Now, let us put those threads together and ask the hard questions. Could current events actually be lining up with biblical prophecy? If so, why should anyone care, whether you follow a faith tradition or not? A world magnetized by Jerusalem. Think of Jerusalem like an emotional relay station. Religions, nations, politicians, and media outlets keep rooting their anxieties and hopes through that city. It is not only about sacred sites or national pride, it is about identity and narrative. For many people, Jerusalem is where history reveals its deepest meaning. For others, it's a political hotbed. But the effect is the same: intensely focused attention, amplified stakes, and repeated crises. Why does that matter? Because a concentrated focus breeds reaction. When a tiny piece of land becomes the symbol of so many things, memory, promise, fear, justice, even small incidents escalate into regional or global flashpoints. That's why almost every prophecy-focused interpreter points to Jerusalem. The symbolic density makes it a geopolitical accelerant. Prophecy plus politics equals high voltage. If you read prophecy-focused passages, Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Revelation, you'll see recurring motifs: a restored homeland, contested holy city, alliances, and sudden wars involving unexpected nations. A climactic intervention, not just political but cosmic. Now overlay modern geopolitics. Israel's neighbors, global powers, nuclear worries, energy routes, and the way technology spreads images in real time. The prophetic motifs don't need to be interpreted as inevitabilities. Think of them instead as a framework people use to make sense of rapid, alarming change. The psychological power of prophetic expectation matters. When societies expect an apocalypse or a messianic intervention, political choices change. Movements accelerate, rhetoric hardens, and the risk of miscalculation rises. A modern example: when small choices ripple big. Let me share a recent human-scale illustration. A year ago, a small protest near a Jerusalem holy site grew badly out of proportion. Social media amplified short video clips. Political leaders issued immediate condemnations, and within hours, regional militias were launching rocket salvos. People on the ground who had come to vent a grievance were shocked that a single scuffle spiraled into days of escalation. The lesson? In the digital age, symbolic places, especially those with prophetic resonance, can function like tinder. Tiny sparks can spread into conflagrations because the audience is global and the emotional stakes are already high. Two lenses, faithful hope versus secular alarm. It helps to distinguish two very different lenses people use. 1. The faith lens. For many believers, the return of Israel and the attention on Jerusalem are fulfillments of Scripture. That doesn't always mean triumphalism. For a lot of people, it's a call to prayer, humility, and urgent evangelism. They read events through a theological map, God's promises, moral accountability, and an ultimate divine resolution. 2. The secular lens. For analysts, the same facts are read as regional politics, historical grievances, resource disputes, and national security. The concern here is human: how to minimize suffering, avoid escalations, and craft diplomatic solutions. Both lenses are real. They sometimes intersect, and sometimes collide. That collision is exactly what makes the situation so volatile. Real people, real risk. Beyond prophecies and geopolitics, there's the human cost. Families living in border towns know the meaning of sirens and shelters. Journalists risk their lives chasing stories on the front lines. Aid workers try to maintain neutral pathways to deliver food and medicine. The big picture discussions can feel abstract until you meet the people who live one rocket, one curfew, one blockade away. Here's a story I heard from an aid volunteer named Miriam. Not her real name, she was running a small clinic in a town near a flashpoint. One evening, a message came through. There's a family, 4 children, trapped in their building. They've been shelled. Miriam and her team navigated checkpoints, moved through ruined streets, and reached a battered apartment where a terrified mother clutched her kids. They carried the family out under cover of night. Miriam said later, "I don't care about the flags or the speeches. I care about those children and the way their tiny hands clung to me. That's why peace matters." That kind of work is done every day by ordinary people who aren't thinking about prophecy or geopolitics. They read just trying to preserve life. What could happen next? Practical scenarios. I'm not predicting events. That's neither wise nor useful. But it helps to think in realistic scenarios and what they would mean. 1. Localized conflict. Skirmishes flare, an exchange of fire, diplomatic pressure increases. Damage is limited but recurring. Outcome, cycles of violence and uneasy truces. 2. Regional war, multiple states become directly involved. This could draw in global powers and disrupt wider stability. Outcome, humanitarian crisis, economic disruption, long recovery. 3. Flashpoint to negotiation, international mediation. Incentives and internal political shifts lead to ceasefires and talks. Outcome, a fragile, negotiated pause, possibly with new security arrangements. 4. Unexpected coup or realignment. Internal political shifts within neighboring countries change their posture about Israel. Outcome, sudden diplomatic recalibration, new alliances or conflicts. Every option has cascading effects on civilians, global markets, refugee flows, and yes, on how people interpret their faith and identity. The practical takeaway, what you can do. Whether you read these events through prophecy or geopolitics, here are grounded, practical steps anyone can take. Stay informed responsibly. Pick a few reliable sources and avoid the viral outrage machine. Context matters more than headlines. Support humanitarian relief. Nonpartisan organizations are on the ground helping people in need. Listen to human stories. Empathy prevents dehumanization. The first step